even though Greenland isn't in the discussion, the national discussion anymore, international discussion really, it is still something to pay attention to. And Lisa's recent piece on how Citizens United and money in politics feeds into Trump's obsession with Greenland, I think is something that everyone needs to learn about and everyone needs to be aware of because it's not something that's going away anytime soon.
Well, yes. So the lens that I put on the anniversary for Citizens United was telling the story of the big donor who's been pushing for U.S. control of Greenland, um, uh, Ron Lauder. But that was just an example of the many ways in which that decision by the U.S. Supreme Court has really harmed and distorted public policy in America. We see that in the tax code, the big giveaways through the Trump tax policies, for example, that have really advantaged his funders. We've seen numerous other ways in which he's been trying to cater to his donors, as with Venezuela, and this notion that he is going to be the person who determines which companies get to invest in or change their investments in Venezuela to take advantage of the U.S. toppling of the leader of Venezuela. So those are the foreign policy, some of the many foreign policy components. We also saw and have seen how Trump was really pushing Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine to open up access to rare earth minerals in Ukraine, and that also benefited some of Trump's main funders, including Ron Lauder and his investments. And so those are just foreign policy examples. Domestically, we also see that distortion. So just given the fact that Greenland was in the news, and it's been so puzzling, I think, to many people, why suddenly the United States of America, through Trump's demands, has been focused so much on Greenland. And when you look at the money trail, what you see is that a very big donor to Trump has been pushing him and offering to be his liaison to getting control of Greenland. And so it's just an example of the type of, in my view, corruption, not necessarily illegal corruption under federal law, but the way that Citizens United has corrupted our foreign policy, distorted it in ways that really actually hurt American interests, our national interests, our domestic interests.
Yeah, and I think it's important maybe to go back and just kind of break down what Citizens United is. It's we've had that ruling in place for so long; it feels ubiquitous. But I feel like there's a lot of people who don't understand how much that changed the landscape. Could you give us a little breakdown about what Citizens United was and what some of the starkest differences are since that ruling was issued?
Yes, so Citizens United is a ruling that was issued by the Roberts Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision in 2010. And what it did was try to displace the role of Congress in regulating the spending to influence our elections. And in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court infamously claimed that money is speech, entitled to full First Amendment protection, so that any regulation of it would likely be struck down. In this instance, the Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, was revisiting previous precedents that had upheld limitations on outside money. And just to go back a little further, the reason why the money that was unleashed by Citizens United is called dark money is because dating back to the 1970s, there have been campaign finance laws that require that money given directly to candidates or to parties be disclosed, and that it be limited, that a person could only give so much per year in order to limit the influence of the super rich on our democracy. Those limits were challenged in federal court in the 1970s in a case that, it turns out, Charles Koch, one of the most now famous billionaires on the planet, helped bankroll the litigation in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. And that ruling basically limited those campaign finance rules to candidates and to campaigns. And it also allowed super rich people to finance their own campaigns. So it allowed David Koch a few years later to run for vice president on the Libertarian Party ticket. That was a result of that decision. But even within that decision, there was still a limitation on this outside money, on people spending money outside of those parameters to influence elections. And but there weren't sufficient limitations. And so starting in 1996, there was an effort after Koch helped orchestrate an effort to capture the congressional delegation from Kansas through a dark money operation, along with other dark money that's starting to seep in. Congress began hearings to reform the campaign laws, and that culminated in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BICRA, which was also known as McCain-Feingold. And so those were rules that were designed to get at the money that was not going to a candidate, was not going directly to a party, but was being spent outside to influence those elections. And in the City United decision, the court said, in essence, that Congress could not limit that spending, that outside money spending. And it even asserted that such spending would be of little value if it wasn't directed by the candidate, even though it's plain that it's very advantageous to have outside groups running smear campaigns against your political opponents that you get to have deniability about. And it also has turned out, since Citizens United, that decision in 2010, since that decision, in most of our elections, more money is spent by these so-called outside groups than by the candidates themselves. So the disclosed money is dwarfed by the money that's spent by outside groups. And Supreme Court made this happen, and the decision is really suspect for other reasons. But I'll stop there, Cameron, and toss it back to you.
No, that was perfect. Thank you. And I think the one of the important things to recognize is that this decision by the Supreme Court, it's not ancient history. This is something that happened, what, 2015? Is that right? 2010. Okay. So still, I mean, still within the Roberts Court. And it is very easy to see the difference, the pre-Citizens United world political landscape to now. And what I really enjoyed about your piece is it kind of crystallizes how Donald Trump, as president, it allows him to feed on his worst impulses. Say what you will about him, he's a very greedy person. He likes to amass wealth and he likes to get money no matter what. Now, I'd be curious to hear your take is, as other presidents, Obama, well, I guess Biden, and first term Trump, how did they navigate the Citizens United landscape versus how Trump is doing it now?
Well, if you look at the statistics, so it's very hard to fully assess how much money is being spent by these outside groups because it's dark. It's not disclosed. There's no limit on it, but we see it appearing in a number of ways. So for example, you can see the PACs have to disclose how much money they receive, and who they get it from, but they can get it from groups that don't disclose who they got the money from. So it creates a bit of a shell game. So for example, we can see the enormous amount of money that Trump has raised or was raising between 2020 and 2024. You can see that, but some of that money, it gives you a name of a group, but you can't actually see who then is funding that group. But sometimes you can see the names of the billionaires. They want to be known. Some of them want him to know out loud and in public that they're funding him. They're writing $1 million check at Mar-a-Lago or what have you. But a lot of the money that has been spent over the last 15 years is dark. It's being spent by groups that don't disclose the original donor, that are spending tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a year in election years to influence those elections. And back in it would have been 2016, Charles Koch's election influence operation, which was then called, was it called Stand Together? It's had like 4 names in the last decade, but his operation announced that they were going to spend $887 million to influence the 2016 presidential campaign. And they even bought a URL called 887million.com that was registered at the Koch Industries headquarters in Wichita, that address for that website. So, but now who gave that 887 million? How much of it was Charles Koch versus Charles Koch's friends in the petroleum industry or, other allies on the right? That information is not disclosed, but we do know that they projected spending that much. And in fact, recently the Koch operation, America's Prosperity, which has now become one of the names that they are using more as an umbrella for some of their grassroots operations around elections, around getting people out to vote, and advertising, has announced that in this midterm year they're going to spend more than in any previous midterm year. But again, that money, we know some of it comes from Coke. We know perhaps some of it comes from Coke Industries, but we don't know where it comes from. And so the contrast, I suppose, first of all, when you look at what can be seen by some of these groups that are called C4 groups under the IRS code, their total spending around elections or during election cycles, which may not include all focus on elections, but a lot focus on elections, it has been rising. Like the curve on it is extraordinary since 2010. And in most of those elections, except for the 2020 election, groups aligned with Republicans were outspending Democrats. So there was like one outlier year in 2020 where, based on the assessments, the Democrats outspent in that year through outside money the Republicans. For the most part, it has favored Republicans. But for Trump, as my article discusses and as you point out, this system, the system that Citizens United enabled, really allows those super rich people to curry enormous favor with the people who are elected to represent us, including a president. And it sort of allows a shakedown, basically, by the politician to say, to basically say, come to the table, or come support my ballroom, or, fund this or that, or fund the Kennedy Center or something, so it creates a circumstance in which people are using their enormous wealth to get far more influence than ordinary people in a democracy, which is by definition supposed to be democracy of the people, with each person being equal, versus a dollarocracy, as Bob McChesney and John Nichols labeled it a few years back, where it's the amount of dollars you have, not your vote. And that is, fundamentally altering our democracy. And it means that you can have a Congress that is willing to take money away from Medicaid, take money away from providing health insurance subsidies for Americans who are hardworking and need access to healthcare, and instead allocate it to things like ICE, or allocate it to programs that, basically then become another vehicle for contracts. So, for example, with ICE, one of Donald Trump's supporters has been Eric Prince, from the Prince fortune, which was a Detroit fortune of automobile components. Eric Prince has been known for his work around the world with Soldiers of Fortune, basically people who are being hired to be military in other countries. And he has wanted a piece of the pie of money coming out of DHS. And now we have an administration that is spending more money on DHS than has ever been spent in history. We have an ICE operation that is funded. We don't know all the contracts that have been given as a result versus direct hires, but this is rife with, the potential for rewarding people who support the person in power.
Right. And those people have a larger voice in expressing themselves to the president because they are able to buy that access, essentially. Would that be correct?
They are. And then the converse, because of Trump's disposition, is punishing people who don't go along with him, just like we've seen with the efforts to get settlements or commitments from law firms over DEI, to basically go after anyone who he perceives as not playing ball with him, that he wants to get money out of. We've seen, one of the, I think most egregious examples we've seen is the way in which Trump and his agents, his agent at the FCC, for example, have used the power of the federal government to try to pressure local stations in terms of their coverage, or national stations like CBS. And we've seen the interests of billionaires who want mergers go along with that pressure to CBS in order to get their merger, while their heads are also supporting Trump. And so in that circumstance, let me unpack that a little better, which is to say, you had big financial backers of Trump who were trying to get a merger of these massive media companies through. And you had Trump upset at CBS for daring to have an interview with Kamala Harris in a lawsuit that really had no merit, claiming how dare they edit an interview, which is what TV magazines and news shows do all the time. They take a portion of the interview and make it, make a 10-minute interview, a 5-minute interview, or what have you. But CBS settled that case and gave control of 60 Minutes basically to a right wing operative, Barry Weiss, Bari Weiss, and in the process, then the merger, this really valuable merger, all went through, and so that corrupted, not just in my view, not just the process for assessing antitrust issues, which are generally important and underappreciated in terms of control of media assets or control of industries or assets, but it also had an effect on message, on policy, on communications, on the way CBS is telling the story of the news, as we saw with the CCOT interview, or the CCOT piece within 60 Minutes that was suppressed by Bari Weiss, and that had cleared all other hurdles except the political test. So you now have Trump trying to use the federal government to choose winners and losers, mainly to choose himself and to benefit his supporters in ways that would certainly be considered to be viewpoint discrimination, like targeting people who dare to speak out against him, like Jimmy Kimmel. That, as we saw also, which is not the power of the federal government. The federal government is not supposed to be used to choose winners and losers, or to punish or promote media outlets based on whether they are kneeling to the president who's not king.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a point, and Alicia in the chat mentioned it as well, that with Trump, it's not so much dark money as so much as it is people publicly trying to buy him, or buy his favor. With the example of Elon Musk, he invested heavily into the 2024 election and essentially bought himself a short-term seat in Trump's cabinet. And then we saw at his inauguration, it was the room was filled with billionaires and American oligarchs, all who have since done whatever they can. Jeff Bezos, he spent how much on Melania's documentary that if anyone wants to go see, there's plenty of seats, I'm sure, in theaters near.
There are plenty of seats. That's what all the reporting shows.
Yeah. And Elon Musk was able to not only access very private personal data of every American, but was also able to close investigations into his companies. And we've even seen Tim Cook at Apple. He's gone and brought gifts and tried to gain favor. And recently, under the radar, like you mentioned in your piece, is Ron Lauder, who's attempting to get rare earth minerals out of Greenland. And this is similar to a deal he got in Ukraine. Is that correct?
Right. And I really appreciate the point you raised and that the viewer raised, because there's the progeny of Citizens United. And so just 3 months after Citizens United, there was a case called Speech Now versus FEC. And that's the decision that allowed the creation of super PACs. And so without those super PACs, where this a massive amount of money is coming in, Musk would not have been able to exert that kind of influence. So there's the dark money that was directly from Citizens United, and then there's just the sort of unlimited money that came out of as a result of cases following the decision that money is speech, and that we can't limit it, we can't restrict it. I think that the court was wrong in that case, and it was actually an illegitimate decision for reasons that I'd love to share with you all. But the bottom line is it's Citizens United and the whole series of cases that have come after that have allowed people like Musk to have such a disproportionate role in our elections and then get rewarded by the winner, like you said, with a co-presidency, but also access to our most sensitive data. And then it certainly looks like investigations were shut down into him, and he's expanded his contracts with the government and expanded his personal wealth as well as a result. And so I don't care that he's the richest man on the planet. I think there should be a real tax code that actually does have progressive taxation for billionaires. When I look at these billionaires who spend big money in elections, I looked at one of them in Pennsylvania. I look at them all the time. Basically, if they spend like $100 million for example, let's just say a particular billionaire spent $100 million. They've got multi-billions. That's the equivalent of an ordinary, as I said in the piece, that's the equivalent of an ordinary person with an ordinary amount of net worth spending like money on coffee, buying coffee at Starbucks or, at Dunkin' Donuts once a week. Because 100 million to a billionaire is like pocket change, but it's huge in its impact on our elections. Doesn't affect them. They certainly could afford to pay as much in taxes as they're paying to play in our political sphere, but they're not. A lot of them are not. In fact, Warren Buffett has said, famously said repeatedly, his secretary pays more in taxes than him because the IRS code is so tilted in favor of the billionaires. And I think almost most Americans would agree that billionaires need to be taxed in a much more proportionate way, in a much more fair way in terms of the taxes they're paying. But instead, because the tax policy that Trump has put through at Koch's urging, just to be really clear about that, um, despite Koch's efforts to say like he doesn't like Trump and they don't like each other, but he sure likes his policies. He sure likes having someone there willing to do their bidding. The fact is that the tax policy is grotesquely distorted because these billionaires have so much influence, and then they're using that excess cash to basically buy further control and access within our elections and to politicians. And Trump is, I guess, particularly open. I'm not sure that's the right word, but out front about that the shakedown that basically he's engaged in on a regular basis. And in fact, he touts it. He talks about destroying the East Wing of the White House and how the American people aren't going to have to pay for his 300/400 million dollar ballroom that no one wanted besides him, that no one needs, that can't possibly be finished before the end of his lawful term as president. And yet he's using that as another vehicle to demand and get favors, basically money from these corporations, and even to get baubles like Tim Cook giving Donald Trump that, crystal thing, as we see leaders from around the world and corporate titans come to basically kiss his ring and give him gifts. It's extraordinarily corrupt in my view.
Yeah. Well, and you just reminded me of I was doing some research in the ballroom when the money, his first announcement was people who were donating, and I was, digging into where exactly it was going, and it's going through a nonprofit foundation, and so, which means all of those contributions are tax deductible. So in a sense, we are still paying for it. Yeah, it's whether or not it actually gets built, that money is going to Trump, that is going to his, amass his ego, if nothing else. And it's still something that we have to foot the bill for.
Well, that's
Now,
right.
my
The tax
last,
piece. Oh, sorry about that. Tax piece is huge. Thank you for underscoring it, Cameron, because it means that those companies that are making that donation pay even less in taxes as a result.
right. It's actually more of a kickback for them than anything. Um, Now, my last question is even though Citizens United is relatively new, 15, 16 years, it feels like during both Trump administrations, its impact has been accelerated. And we are now in a point where, for better, for worse, I'll say it, people coming into the political landscape, this is the norm. They don't know anything different, and they don't see why they shouldn't play ball in this. I mean, you mentioned it yourself earlier, 2020, as much as Democrats rail against Citizens United, they understand that they have to play that same game. They are still using this to their advantage as well. Is there a way back? Is there a way to undo this easily? Or are the people who benefit from it benefiting too much for it to be undone?
Hmm. Well, I do think it's really, we can't expect one side to unilaterally disarm when the other side is just pummeling them with this cash. Um, and so that's the challenge that your question poses. But in fact, if you look at the actual activity on the Hill, what you see is Democrats almost overwhelmingly supporting a reforming Citizens United, at a minimum calling for disclosure, and then more than that, calling for that decision to be repealed or rescinded. We have calls for court reform. There's really a growing number of people who recognize that the Supreme Court is, is in cloud, covered in this cloud of its own issues of corruption with Clarence Thomas, who, by the way, never should have sat on that case. That 5-4 ruling, he cast the deciding vote, even though his wife had just received $500,000 from his benefactor Harlan Crow to launch a group, a C4 group, to take advantage of the decision to come. Didn't recuse himself. And then you saw a report that in that same time frame, Leonard Leo was arranging for Jenny Thomas to be secretly paid, purportedly for polling. And so she was getting money from sent to her, arranged for her from someone who had an agenda before the courts, including one of the very group that arranged for Jenny's pay, submitting an amicus brief in the Shelby County case where the court struck down the VRA. You had, you had Trump supporting Jenny's, ties to the election claims of Trump in 2020, the slate, these slates of fake electors, and you had Thomas sitting on the immunity case. There's more to the story than all that, but these are some examples of the types of the corruption we're seeing and the distortion of the law, even at the Supreme Court. And so there are calls for reform, but those calls are almost entirely pushed by Democrats who recognize how rotten this system is and want it fixed, and almost uniformly opposed by Republicans. So while Republicans will say, look, you Democrats are, you have super PACs too. Yeah, because the law has allowed them. But the only ones who are actually calling for reforms are Democrats. And so I do think there's a possibility in the coming years for us to get those reforms if people come to Congress who want to make those reforms. If we insist on reform being part of the conversation, you can't get voting rights back until you reform the court. We're not going to be able to actually expand our voting rights until we reform Citizens United. So I'm hopeful, but it is daunting, but it doesn't have to be this way, and we can change it.
Yeah, and I do want to point out there have been successes at the local level. When I was a reporter in Arizona, the former attorney general there, he spent his post-political career getting dark money out of politics in Arizona. Now, that was fiercely opposed by the Republican legislature, and they've tried to get rid of these transparency laws, but they have proven effective. And in lieu of federal action, are there other instances of local pushback against dark money that you've seen it successful?
Yeah, there's actually been pushback in Maine recently, although Leonard Leo tried to weigh in on that through some of the groups he was funding. Montana has been one of the states that for a long time has sought to prevent corporate distortion of public policy, because Montana experienced so much redirection of its policy by the copper barons. So for more than a century, Montana has tried to prevent corporations from having an excessive influence on democracy in that state, even though the state overall, has gone, red, went for Trump, et cetera. At the grassroots level, people get it. There have been rallies at the state house capitol there in Montana in recent years that had farmers and ranchers and progressives and Republicans and NRA owners, NRA gun owners, et cetera, coming together and saying, yeah, we need to actually stand together to protect our democracy from the influence of big money, including big corporate money.
Yeah, no, and that's a really important thing to point out is when you get to the local level, when you're talking about people and not going specifically to parties, the majority of people support getting money out of politics. It's just unfortunate that the people who are in politics, there's not enough support there yet. But I guess that just comes back to the people. Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope everyone enjoyed listening. Again, Lisa, if you want to plug your newsletter, if you are here and you don't read hers, definitely subscribe. It's fantastic.
Oh, well, I am so glad to be here, Cameron. Really love Below the Beltway. So proud of the amazing work that Courier News is doing, and Tara and the whole team have been doing. And I'm proud to be part of this effort through the Grave Injustice Substack. And I've got a new book out called Without Precedent. that talks about the Supreme Court and John Roberts and what's gone wrong and what we can do about it. So I hope you'll subscribe to all of this. Subscribe to Below the Beltway. Subscribe to Grave Injustice. Subscribe to Courier's whole set of columnists, and you will be, I think, really well informed and armed with information, and also hopefully a bit of knowledge and humor from the conversations that we have like this. Even though these things are not humorous, but just to be able to understand it doesn't have to be this way, and we can change it.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for taking the time. I can't wait to read your book, and I'll probably be bugging you with questions about that too.
Awesome, Cameron. Thank you so much.
Yeah, see ya.